Good afternoon. Welcome to the afternoon session. This is the parallel breakout session 1A, Globalization and Civilization, Understanding Conflict and Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. My name is Alejandro Reyes. I'm Director of Knowledge Dissemination at the Asia Global Institute. I, until recently, was managing Asia Pacific policy in the Canadian Foreign Ministry, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. And I just want to, again, thank our staff and the staff at the Asia Society for enabling us to meet here, which is a fantastic location. Now, we're running short of time. We're going to try to end this session at the originally scheduled time. So if you do the math, we'll probably be coming in under the hour. I might stretch it slightly. But so I'm just going to dispense with sort of any lengthy preamble. And also, you know everybody here. Kishore Mahbubani, a distinguished diplomat from Singapore, Professor Chen Zhiwu, who is the director of the Asia Global Institute, Yoshikazu Kato, who is an adjunct associate professor at the AGI, and Ananth Krishnan, who is an AG fellow, Asia Global Fellow, and an experienced journalist, was a recently correspondent in Beijing for India Today. So I'm just going to launch right into it. We've heard today about decoupling and whether it's even possible. Last night, Professor Vogel said he didn't think it was possible. There's talk of partial decoupling. Some people say that it can happen. So I just wanted to talk about the power relationships in the region, where the characterization of what's going on between the US and China seems to be strategic competition, some say. Some say it's a clash of civilizations. Some say that it's something else. It's just a rivalry of the superpower being sort of usurped by the up-and-coming power. Now, Professor Mahbubani, Kishore, you have written a book that deals with many of these issues that we've talked about today. And in fact, you have it on your lap. Has the West lost it? It's an excellent book. It's very quick read and fantastic and engaging read. So, Kishore, can you just get us started by talking from your perspective on has the West lost it, and what are the power relationships that we're seeing in the world today and in the region?
Wow. Okay, I'll try to be brief. But what's interesting is that we take the biggest subject of all, civilizations, which are slightly bigger than countries and companies. And then we squeeze the time we allocate to civilizations, which is, in a sense, captures our perspective of the world, because we are so focused on the very short term, the very immediate, the US-China trade war, the demonstrations in Hong Kong, that we lose sight of the bigger picture. And what's strange is that, we live in a world of lots of uncertainties, and we're going to spend all the time talking about any uncertainty you want, but everybody forgets to notice the certainties. There are some certainties in the world which are unshakable and unstoppable. And so let me mention a few. The first certainty is that the last 200 years of Western domination of world history was a major historical aberration. Now, it was an aberration because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So it was inevitable. It was inevitable that China and India and the rest of Asia would come back. So all you're seeing today, the return of Asia, is a certainty. It was going to happen. And it is happening. Now, the second certainty, right? Why is this happening? Why is it happening now? The simple answer is that the Asians finally stood up and learned from the West, right? There was a gift of Western wisdom to the world in many, many areas, including science and technology, rule of law, free market economics, all the things that propel the West forward. The Asians finally said, okay, let's learn it, let's apply it, And so they're taking off. So that's another certainty. We know exactly why the world is changing, why the world is getting better, thanks to the gift of Western wisdom. Now, what's the other unfortunate certainty? The unfortunate certainty is that even though that this should be a moment of triumph for the West, that this should be the West celebrating that we have shared the gift of Western wisdom with the world, and I document, as I say, all this in the book, as the West lost it. The West should be celebrating. We did it. We have made the world a better place. But as you all know, the West has never been more depressed. Proof, they elected Donald Trump. Proof, they have Brexit. And these are all, by the way, not accidental phenomenon, These are the result of a major civilizational shift that is taking place and therefore causing all kinds of political dislocation, a rebalancing in the civilizational arena. And every time you have a rebalancing in the civilizational arena, you have turbulence. So the turbulence we are experiencing now is another certainty, something that's predictable. It's inevitable. And we are going to live through this turbulence. So whether we like it or not, we happen to be around at the moment in history when we're seeing the greatest shifts of power ever between civilizations. We're moving from a mono-civilizational world to a multi-civilizational world. And until we adjust to the multi-civilizational world, it is a certainty that we will have turbulence.
Thank you very much, Kishore. I'm wondering if I could just follow up a bit on that question, because, of course, we're seeing the United States somewhat in retreat from participating fully, as it did, in the same world system that it created. But, Trump is not going to be around for forever. And what is permanent, what is not, in the sense that, of course, the people who talk about restoration after Trump, but that's probably not going to happen. There's someone talk about a new normal. The United States is not going to go peacefully into the sweet night. So how do you see that working?
Well, that's the subject of my next book.
That's why I asked.
I actually am publishing a book on US-China relations. Actually, it's been submitted to the publisher yesterday and in New York. So it's coming out in April. The title, of course, has to be provocative because I don't like dull titles. The provocative title is Has China Won? And another thing I'm very certain about, absolutely certain about, is that US-China relations will get worse in the next 10 years. In some ways, Andrew hinted of this with his talk of the alpha male. When the alpha male is about to retreat and become the number 2 male, no alpha male retreats and becomes the number 2 male without putting up a fight. So it has nothing to do with Donald Trump. Donald Trump can come, Donald Trump can go. It's about a deeper structural shift in relations between the world's number 1 power and the world's number 2 power. And I'm so lucky that I'm in the world of geopolitics and not in economics. All you economists, you say on the one hand, on the other hand, we in geopolitics say it's a matter of certainty. Whenever the number 2 power is about to overtake the number 1 power, and that's going to happen in the next 10 years, there will be turbulence between the number 1 power and number 2 power. It's a law of geopolitics, right? It's been around for thousands of years. It's going to carry on in the next 10 years. So it doesn't matter who's there. But of course, this is not going to be portrayed as the United States trying to stop China. Of course not. The United States is trying to save China, trying to rescue China from its Communist Party system. United States is going to try and liberate 1.4 billion Chinese people and make them a happier people. That's what they say is going to happen, right? And that's why you got to, in this area, you have to dig below the surface and not pay attention to the words people are using to understand the deeper geopolitical forces driving all this.
So you won't give us a preview of the answers, has China won?
Maybe after our colleagues.
So Professor Chen, has China won? What is the Chinese perspective? How do you see this playing out?
Okay, I'm not so sure whether I can give the Chinese perspective or not. Huh? But I want to follow on Kishore's point, especially his call for us to dig deeper below the surface. So what is below the surface in terms of this structural or civilizational shift from the West to the East? Of course, related to this question is something many of us have been very much intrigued by, especially when the director of policy research at the Pentagon in the US coined this phrase, or was trying to coin this phrase about to define or describe or label the upcoming clash between China and the US. Somehow she said, she's reported to have said something like, this is beyond even a civilizational clash because the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US was, after all, between two different denominations in Christianity. But China is not a Christian society, so now it's even more serious. But I have to say that, of course, I want to make sure that I can say something within like a few minutes of the allowed time. I think if there is, if we look for a very deep underlying root for the possible conflict or clash between China and the US or the West, I would say it's not really a civilizational clash or clash of civilizations. It's much more of a clash of ideologies. To make a long story short, recently I've been trying to use a religious framework to analyze the two civilizations, so to speak. As many of us know, the Chinese society is not religious. If we really push, then maybe Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism all combined really make up the sort of the cultural civilizational foundation of China. So what I'm trying to say is that the Chinese society, if we really push, is at most a polytheistic society. So we believe in multiple gods. In particular, Confucian scholars will say that we're supposed to worship our ancestors as gods. So there are about 400 million Chinese families today. Each family has a different set of gods we worship. So multiply 400 million by, let's say, 5. What is the number of gods we separately worship? So what I'm trying to say is that when we believe in all the different gods, we respond to calls by those hundreds of millions of different gods. So that's why the Chinese population is much more difficult to mobilize because we don't believe in one mono-god who can really call upon us and to get all of us excited and then want to fight. That does not work, okay? But of course, for the Christian societies, there's only one God. Of course, for Islamic societies, there's also one God. The power of a mono-God is much, much bigger than than most of us think. To make a long story short, so when you think about why there were the Crusades, and then why Arabs and Persians came to China about 1,300 years ago. So many of us talk about how the maritime Silk Road for China really started. The official line from the party in China would say that, it's the Chinese people who started the maritime Silk Road. But the actual historical evidence points in the opposite direction. It's the Arabs who first came probably in the second half of the 7th century, at least in the 8th century. They came to Guangzhou and then also Quanzhou and Yangzhou. not to make profits, to start globalization, so to speak. They came for the simple reason that is to spread Islam to China. Of course, later, by accident, they discovered, wow, actually China had their silk and many other products, goods that the Arabs and Persians did not have back home. So that's how trade sort of emerged as a byproduct. But let me not go there too far. Okay, the other thing many of us have been exposed to is the commercial revolution that started in the 10th century Europe. Some of you may know what prompted those Italians and Jews and others in Europe to start the commercial revolution. It was mainly because the Christians back then, they thought the world was coming to an end around the millennial anniversary of Jesus Christ's crucifixion. So that drove many of them to want to pay a tribute to the Holy Land in Jerusalem. So now you see why the religion-driven desire to go such long distance later happened to also promote the emergence of the commercial revolution, really long distance trade. So what I'm trying to say is that when there is this one God that you are supposed to believe in only, okay, you are not supposed to believe in any other gods, unfortunately, that one God lived and died in one place on the whole earth. So all the followers are supposed to go there to pay a pilgrimage. For someone like me who is not religious, I'm supposed to worship my ancestors. Guess where my ancestors are buried and are supposed to be worshipped? In my village. So I would not have to go that far, thousands of miles in order to visit the Holy Land. For me, my Holy Land is in my hometown, only there, nowhere else. So what I'm trying to say is that so when you have the Chinese society structured based on multiple gods, we're supposed to separately worship. And the American society and Western European society is structured based on one common God. So which society, largely speaking, has more mobilization power for one common cause, whatever that common cause would be. Of course, that common cause at different times had different interpretations, different representations. So today, so this is why I thought, okay, the clash of, if it's really between, the clash today between the US and China is really between two different civilizations, I would not have to worry too much about that because the Chinese civilization has much, much less mobilization power than Christianity-based mobilization power. So then, should we really not worry about the possible clash between China and the US? Well, we do want to worry about, but for a totally different reason, because it is the 20th century when China imported communism from the Soviet Union in the late 1910s. That's really the first time that a much more structured religion, so to speak, was brought to China to make it a little bit more concrete. You know, when I was little, as a child, I always wondered, why do we have Sundays and Saturdays? Why should this day be different from other days of the week? Well, later I learned, well, the Christian calendar was imported from somewhere else, but we are not Christians in China. So what I'm trying to say is the Chinese people used not to have rituals, calendar-based rituals, other than the Chinese New Year and so on. Whereas for Christians, every Sunday there's supposed to be a mass, right? But after communism was imported into China, then the weekly mass, that practice was introduced. When I was in high school, college, and so on, I had to attend political study sessions. every Friday afternoon. No exemption, no request for absence could be granted. So that weekly ritualistic practice finally brought a new structure. That structure restructured people's lives in China. And then as a result of this, the ability to mobilize the Chinese population today through the party, of course, especially now through this new app called 学习强国, or every party member and others is supposed to check in to spend at least 1 hour every morning to listen to the party general secretary's new speeches, new documents, and other new theories, watching government-approved TV programs, and also how much time you spend, what you spend your time on, and so on. It's all part of that big data, that database, right? So now this kind of new high-frequency rituals have served to really make the Chinese society much more mobilizable to fight for whatever common cause the party would tell everyone to fight for. So I would say, that now this clash of ideologies is really the main framework to rely on in order to understand what we're really talking about, what other countries may be facing. I should stop here. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Zhiwu, can I just follow this up a little bit? If you're sitting, say, in Canada or the United States, the vocabulary is not necessarily about the contrast that you've brought, but people will refer to values. Values-driven policy. So a favorite term these days in Western developed countries is, talk to the like-minded. Or if you look at the Canada-China dispute, for example, Canada likes to talk about how, well, we're a rule of law country, or Canada's a rule of law country, and others may not be. I'm wondering if you could sort of tackle a bit of that. Are we seeing some of that differential, that clash in terms of civilizational roots in that debate about values?
Yeah, so of course today we have very limited time. So the way Confucianism has structured the Chinese society is really almost exclusively focused on the clan, on the lineage, the kinship network. So beyond the kinship network, the kind of common values that would unify and structure the whole society are relatively lacking, especially in comparison to how Christianity has structured different Western societies. So our has been a great help to me because he has allowed me to really understand the Catholic, what it means by growing up as a Catholic, especially very devoted, under a very devoted Catholic mother and grandmother and so on. So from talking to Al over the last few months, I learned a lot. In particular, it made me think that me as a Chinese grew up without that much structure, other than I was supposed to worship my ancestors and follow the elderly. So beyond the clan, then other families or clans may have a different sets of values. Of course, the Confucianist teachings, and that will be the common value system that cuts across to some extent the clans. But the more sort of localized things can be very, very, or are usually very specific to each clan. So on the other hand, if you talk about a Catholic society or Protestant society, then the values that unify all the members are much more detailed and more structured.
Great, thank you. Kato-san, I'm wondering if you could give us a perspective from Japan, and in whatever you've heard so far, or to talk about how you see the power relationships in the region.
Thank you, El. I've learned a lot from the previous speakers. It's a very, I've been a reader of Professor Mahbani, Can Asian think the great convergence? I read about that. And Professor Chen, you're a very deep and historically complicated explanation of why this disputes or conflicts happens. I think I don't think I can represent Japanese, but maybe somehow Japanese perspective, how the world looks like and what can Japan do maybe in this region. First of all, I think one key word is the reality, the inevitable reality. I think now, like the Trump administration described the U.S.-China relation, now this is a strategic competition. It's a kind of century of competition. And now Japan, as an ally of the United States, and China is our largest trading partner. So now, for Japanese diplomacy and foreign policy, even national strategy, you have to take balance between the two very much critical important relationship in this region. It's a main challenge for Japanese national strategy and foreign policy, and this is a reality. And I think maybe in previous internal discussion, sent us, and this is a clash of civilization or a new Cold War. Of course, I cannot bet, but I think I somehow agree with Professor Chen pointed out. This is more like the clash of ideology, confrontation of different political system. I mean, between U.S. and China, even different ways of survival. And which one would be more relevant or sustainable, only history can verify. But I think this is the reality of strategic competition based on the clash of different ideology and different model of development, and based on more maybe complicated religious or historic perspectives. But this is the reality, and we have to face it. And for Japan, how to survive in between. Japan, after the end of Second World War, we have been democratized, including by the U.S. occupation, and now we are enjoying this post-war prosperity. Of course, somebody says it's a lost 3 decades, and now Japan is entering a new era. But this is a very important challenge in this region, and maybe what worries Japan or worries me, somehow in front of this situation. Because now U.S. and China, this is much more than trade war. This is more like strategic and politics and ideology. And I do not think the complete or comprehensive decoupling is happening. Like Professor Vogel last night spoke. The decoupling is unrealistic, but we shouldn't underestimate any possibilities or risks on undermining different areas, like studying abroad, education, or tourism, or economy or trade, because the ideological confrontation could be a trigger to undermine these very important communication, understanding, and trust between U.S. and China. So this is somehow undermining the regional stability and prosperity, and this is what worries Japan very much. And this is the first point. And I think maybe a kind of miscalculation between U.S. and China also worries Japan. I don't know, it's not necessarily right or wrong, but I think now the U.S. assumes China is trying to change the world. China is trying to govern this world or region based on their own ideology or development model. And now China assumes that the U.S. is trying to change China, including through Hong Kong, a kind of a color revolution theory. But I think this is not that likely to happen. Of course, now China is challenging the U.S. economically and militarily. And U.S. may be partially trying to contain China, politically or something ideologically. But this doesn't mean China and U.S. is competing, very much comprehensively and entirely. But now what worries me is somehow, mutual calculation or misjudgment. What is your real intention? If U.S. assumes China is trying to change the world, you could be a game changer, But China, very obviously, China has developed its own country based on the basic order since the end of World War II. China has been the very, important beneficiary, right? So I do not think China is trying to change or creating the completely new or different model to govern this world. It's very unlikely to happen. And I think now what the U.S. trying to do in front of the rise of China, I would agree with Harvard professor Joseph Nye said, only China can contain China. So, let's learn to work with China. But now the reality is, I have read Professor Mahbani's the Convergence, but I don't know how do you understand your concept at this moment. China is very unlikely to converge with liberal democracy. China is now increasingly pursuing its own ways based on its own logic, own civilization, own political system. So this is the reality. But it's very unlikely to see comprehensive decoupling. It's so somehow different with the time of Cold War, but it's a kind of a new Cold War. We have to very carefully use these words, but I think somehow it's similar. So we need to be very much careful about that. And now, let me move on to what Japan can do. As you guys know, our Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he's a relatively active person. And he has had a relatively good relation with major powers leader, including Trump, Xi Jinping, Putin, Modi. Maybe he's, maybe relatively good relations maker in today's world. And even now, he's trying to meet Kim Jong-un in North Korea. So, it's not easy for Japan to have him. And next week, he's going to be the longest administration over the history of Japanese constitution since 1890. The Japanese, the Constitution of the Japanese Empire, 1890. So, he's going to be the longest administration. So it is very important for Japan to have some power foundation to do something. If you use Professor Vogel's word, Japan maybe could slightly more independent or active roles in this world or in this region. So this is maybe some strategic chance for Japan. Of course, we are going to hold the Tokyo Olympics, the second Tokyo Olympics next year. So maybe somehow some chance to create more space to contribute internationally or something like that. And I think now, what can Japan contribute to this region in the Asia Pacific? I think basically two things. One is maintain good relation with the United States. Of course, now we are looking at the Trump's administrations, relatively inward-looking. Somebody would say, irresponsible policies in the Asia Pacific, including withdrawal from the TPP, or neglect on some international cooperation, including Paris Treaty or something like that. But we shouldn't let the United States isolate it. This is not the national interest for Japan. So, given the relatively good relation between Shinzo Abe and Trump, we should maintain the relatively good relation with the United States. Of course, we shouldn't isolate China as well. So, let's see the upcoming Xi Jinping's state visit to Japan next spring. So let's see what happens. And the second thing, I think in terms of collective leadership, of course, this word is institutionalized. Of course, somebody say the deinstitutionalization, but now I think collective leadership would be very much important to tackle some global issues, including the North Korean issue, climate change, terrorism, a lot of issues. I don't know what's going on in Hong Kong, but it's quite important. And now, given the, I just mentioned Abe's relatively strong foundation or power based on constitution, I think now Japan could conduct certain extent of leadership to initiate this regional integration, particularly CPTPP. Since the U.S. withdrew from the TPP, it has been a great damage for Japan, because Japan and the United States, including during the Obama administration, I think you experienced in Canadian government, I think TPP would be the highest and most important and critical free, open, and high standards mechanism based on values and rules. So this is a very much important asset for Japanese diplomacy. But now the situation is something changed. But now our government still trying to lead and not that disappear or backward. So now Japan is trying to lead continuously the CPTPP. So I think this is a very important case for Japanese diplomacy to test how could Japan do, or doing something more independent or active, proactive pacifism, in our government world. So this is something very important time and interesting time for Japanese history, even since the Meiji Restoration. I think it's more than, since the end of the Second World War. Since the Meiji Restoration, now Japan is facing a relatively strategic and important chance to test what responsibility and contribution could we make in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoshi. Quick follow-up. You talk about what Professor Vogel said about Japan possibly taking a more important role, Shinzo Abe's leadership, which is, of course, mark a milestone next week. But what about the historical issues that often intrude, certainly whether in relations with China and South Korea? Is that not a real impediment to Japan taking that, next step, as it were, in its leadership? I mean, you have the trade war right now between South Korea and Japan.
Yeah, of course. If say the historical problem or problems of how to perceive the history during the wartime, we are basically saying the relation with China, People's Republic of China, and South Korea. Of course, North Korea, some problems, including in Southeast Asia. I think, two separated, things, of course, interconnected. One is diplomatically. Diplomatically speaking, our historical problems has already been settled. Diplomatically speaking, Japan, People's Republic of China normalized the relationship in 1972, and with South Korea in 1992. So, diplomatically speaking, this is settled through governmental negotiation. But in terms of civil society, people-to-people understanding and trust, now we can look at a lot of problems, out of upheaval, up and down, So in terms of, the national reconciliation, it takes more time. But, I think I just pointed out the relation with South Korea. I think maybe this is the most difficult and serious diplomatic challenges for Japan at the moment because, of course, in Japan and South Korea, we are not allies, but both of us are allies of the United States in this region as liberal democracy, relatively advanced economy. So we should, dedicate, something powerful to this region. But now, given this historic disputes or, a lot of misunderstanding or, maybe mismanagement by the two governments, now, the historic issues became trigger and undermined a comprehensive, relation between Japan and South Korea, including trade, even some intelligence shared mechanism, South Korea unilaterally abandoned this, agreement. And this worried Japan very much. So I think history always could be a trigger for Japan, for Japan's diplomacy. So now for Shinzo Abe, for example, Yasukuni Shrines issue. Now maybe for our government or administration, only reasonable option is not to go. Don't go there. Or, very carefully speak or mention to historic issues, not to stimulate China's nationalism or patriotism. Otherwise, maybe even, upcoming Xi Jinping's visit would be canceled. Nothing is impossible, given our previous track records. So, Japanese should face it. Historic issues are always very much important and should be carefully managed.
Great, thank you. Anand, react to what you've heard here if you wish, or provide us this perspective. You know intimately India and China and their relationship. How do you see the power relationships then?
Thanks so much, Al. And I should begin by apologizing for this cough that I have. So as part of our fellowship at AGI, we were taken to Beijing and Delhi for 2 weeks. And I think a lot of the fellows came back with various viral infections. And I think one takeaway was that one thing that India has overtaken China is in the quality of its air pollution. So I think that was one takeaway that we had. But I am going to try and give you a little bit of an Indian perspective in terms of how India looks at the world, looks at Asia. And I think the first point that I would make is that I think you should pay attention to what happened in May 2019, which is Modi's re-election. So we're now 5-6 months into Modi 2.0. And I think if you'd, in many ways, the 2019 election was an election of firsts. First time that a single party got a majority in 30 years. First time since 1971 that a leader was re-elected since Indira Gandhi with a majority. So safe to say that Modi is feeling politically very confident, no real political opposition, which is why you see him take moves that previous governments wouldn't have taken, such as in Kashmir by abrogating Article 370, which brought a lot of reaction from China and Pakistan. Having said that, his biggest challenge domestically is the economy. So yesterday we had the very worrying news that growth may fall below 5% in the last quarter, which is for a country like India that has to grow at 10% is deeply worrying. But at the same time, you get the sense that the Modi government is kind of resorting to other means in terms of boosting its legitimacy and popularity with what you saw with Kashmir, with nationalism at home. And I think that has a bearing when we look at India's foreign policy, when we look at how India looks at its place in the world. And I think that for much of today, we focus so much on China and the US that I think it's useful to remember that there's a non-China, non-US world out there, a non-China, non-US perspective out there, which I thank Andrew Sheng for giving us this brilliant image of the orangutan in the forest that wants to be left in peace and choose. So I would add to that saying there's an elephant inhabiting the same forest as well, which does not want to be prodded to pick a side. And if you look at the way India has approached, especially Modi's diplomacy, I think what you can expect to see in this term is kind of what he settled on towards the end of his first term, which had a lot of inconsistencies and ups and downs, and which is being tough on Pakistan, being tough on terrorism, doing more in the immediate neighborhood, India's immediate neighborhood. And in terms of Asia, Modi has put forward what he calls, we've spoken about this before, which is Act East, which is seen as somewhat linked to the whole Indo-Pacific idea. But I think it's also important to kind of remember that there are some differences in how the US is putting forward its idea of the Indo-Pacific and the way India is putting forward its idea of the Indo-Pacific. So if you look at what Modi said at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, his message was Indo-Pacific is inclusive. It's not targeting any one country. And the message was purely aimed at China, which is looking at the Indo-Pacific as something that is exclusive. Having said that, Modi has been less cautious than his predecessors when it comes to security relations with the US, when it comes to relations with Japan. So I think his threshold of what he's willing to do to upset China is kind of different from what his predecessors did. So this has led to perceptions which you read a lot in the press that India is moving closer to the US. But I would not read too much into that because you should also look at what Modi has done with relations with China. And I think the clearest indication of that was last month was President Xi Jinping's visit to India for what India and China are now calling informal summits, which is something that I think is worth paying attention to. Since you had Modi go to China for the first summit, Xi visit India and Modi going back next year. And the summit has kind of been criticized as all optics, no takeaways, but I think one very important takeaway is that Xi Jinping is personally investing in relations with India in a way that he's not doing with any other country through this summit level mechanism. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that both India and China realize that they have a huge number of historical legacy issues in the relationship, starting with the unresolved boundary issue. There's the Pakistan issue as well. But I think there's a consensus that at this current moment in time, they are both dealing with so many problems of their own that they are going to do what it takes to stabilize what is a difficult and complicated relationship. And I think that's a very important and significant takeaway. So I will briefly end by just making the point that it's easy to put countries in boxes and categories, but I think to go back to Andrew Sheng's point, I think we're in a period of a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty. where you'll see countries choose their sides depending on issues. So I think I'll end with that.
Thank you very much. I'll get back to Kishore. I know he wants to say something, but a very quick follow-up. You didn't mention India's withdrawal from RCEP, and I'm just wondering you to put quick context since that's so newsy.
Yeah, I think that's, I've been asked that question 10 times today. 11th time today in terms of why India withdrew from RCEP. Frankly, most people in India don't know either. So the argument Modi gave was a very strange one, which was hard to believe, where he said, you know, I thought of what Mahatma Gandhi would do, and I didn't have the conscience to go through with this, was what he said. But I think one argument is that a lot of the BJP's political support and backing is with traders, small and medium enterprises that the government felt would pay the highest price. I think after the India-ASEAN FTA, the feeling was, in a word, if I had to answer what went wrong, I would say China. In terms of the concerns of what it would do in terms of opening India up when India can't compete. But then the flip side of the argument is what Indian economists were saying is, listen, you need these trade agreements to push you to become more competitive. It's not the other way around, that you wait till you're competitive to join these trade agreements. So we still really haven't had a clear argument, only because my limited understanding from speaking to a couple of people, I don't know if Kishore would have something to say from Singapore and elsewhere, is that they were surprised that they felt that through several rounds of negotiations, India had certain demands and was aware of what the other countries were going to give. But at the very last round, they said, hey, we want this, this, and this, otherwise we're going to walk out. And that's what happened.
Thank you. Kishore, now before we go, we'll go to the audience shortly, but Kishore, we wanted to sort of respond to some of the things that were...
Yeah, just very, very briefly. There were some very significant points that came up. Zhiwu, you referred to the statement by Professor Kiran Skinner. She was director of the policy planning staff of the State Department. And what she said is something very significant. She said this is the first time the United States is having a contest, and the word she used was with a non-Caucasian power. So actually it wasn't religion. It was actually ethnicity that was the issue. And I actually thought that she did the world a big favor by raising the point this is a contest with a non-Caucasian power. Because if you go back to history, and I've been referring to history several times, the one undeniable fact of history is that Western civilization, which is the subject of our discussion, has always had this fear of the yellow peril. It goes back several centuries, and it surfaces from time to time. It surfaced in the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act in the United States in the late 19th century. So if you think that the contest between United States and China is purely driven by rational, ideological considerations, and there is that dimension, but it is very much a multi-dimensional struggle, and one of the dimensions is emotional. And it is emotionally very difficult to accept that a non-Caucasian civilization will become the number one power. And that emotion is a factor. But the trouble is, of course, we live in a politically correct world. We cannot raise these issues publicly because it's not politically correct to raise these issues. But at the same time, it's a real dimension. It's what fueling this very strong anti-China sentiment that has emerged. And by the way, if you do go to the United States today, and you stand up and just try to be balanced on US and China, you're toast. I'm talking about emotions. I'm not talking about reason. Emotions is what is driving this. And you know, Kato-san was asking me about the Great Convergence. Has the Great Convergence ended? The Great Convergence hasn't ended. I keep emphasizing that the Asian countries have succeeded because of the gift of Western wisdom. And the paradox we have today is that it is the Asians who want to stick to the rules-based order that the West gifted to the world in 1945, and it is the West that is walking away from the rules-based order. And Exhibit A, by the way, the most successful international organization in terms of its capacity to deliver. The reason why global poverty is disappearing, the reason why global middle classes are exploding is because international trade has grown. International trade has grown because of the principles of the World Trade Organization. And guess which country is trying to destroy the World Trade Organization today? It's not China. It's the United States. And by the way, I also believe, and this is an argument I emphasize very strongly in this book, the United States is making a fundamental strategic mistake in walking away from multilateral rules, multilateral institutions, multilateral processes, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to benefit the West. Because the West, at the end of the day, is also 12% of the world's population. 88% lives outside. And if the 88% wants to accept this rules-based order, why is the West walking away from it? And this is, incidentally, as part of the Great Convergence, also, you must have a situation where you have to get rid of the rule that says to become the head of the IMF, you must be European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be American. These are anachronistic rules. But even though at the G20 meeting, the leaders promised that from now, after 2008 financial crisis, the leaders of IMF and World Bank were chosen on the basis of merit. They were not chosen on the basis of merit. They still went back to Americans and still went back to Europeans. Now, it is the Western reluctance to accept the rules-based order that they themselves created, which is the source of these problems, and it is not the rest of the world walking away from the Great Convergence. Finally, a quick point on Anand and I completely agree with you and with Andrew Sheng. The rest of the world, which incidentally, even if you add up 1.4 billion in China and 330 million in United States of America, that's 1.7 billion. There's still 6 billion people outside United States and China. And frankly, the 6 billion people, most of them, and this is an argument in my book, don't want to choose. They don't want to get involved in this conflict. You guys want to go and fight it out? Go ahead, fight it out. Don't get us involved. That's the rule. But unfortunately, even though many countries don't want to be asked to choose, they'll be asked to choose. So, for example, when China launched its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? And Asia needs infrastructure. Canberra got a phone call. Australia didn't join. South Korea got a phone call. South Korea didn't join. Japan also got a phone call. Japan also didn't join. So that's how it's a fact of life that you're going to get involved in this thing, even if you want to stay out of it. But if you can get a bigger consensus, then it's going to be much easier. And this is why I think, Anand, the mistake that the fundamental strategic mistake India made in not joining the RCEP is that the RCEP would have anchored India's influence in East Asia. And basically, if you look at the logic of the growth, okay, why has East Asia grown so much faster than South Asia? And the simple answer is that more and more East Asian countries are opening up. And what is shocking is that Indonesia, right? Indonesia can join RCEP, but India cannot. And everybody is talking about shining India. Why can't India catch up with Indonesia in this thing? So that's why it's a big strategic mistake not to join the RCEP. Yeah.
Zhiwu, I know you grabbed your microphone, so if you have one comment.
Just a quick one. I don't want to take too much time to clarify that, when you talk about the non-Caucasian civilization, it's probably an interesting label. What I was trying to say is that the Chinese civilization is not that intimidating because of the lack of mobilization power. I mean, I understand, like in at least in the human history of the last 2 millennia, a lot of the conflicts have been intra-Christian or intra-Islamic conflicts. The Chinese civilization, for the most part, did not play any role there. It's actually pretty interesting for us to think, why is the Chinese civilization not so intimidating or threatening to other civilizations? I mean, I'm not saying this just because I'm Chinese, no. But I think it has more to do with the clan-based focus in terms of civilizational development over the last 2,500 to 3,000 years by Chinese scholars. They don't think too much beyond that. So what that has made the Chinese civilization be in terms of major distinctive characteristics is that they are more local community focused or even lineage or clan focused. So to mobilize the Chinese people to go thousands of miles to attack another society or to engage with another society, that had been very foreign to the Chinese people. Of course, of the 20th century or starting from the 19th century onward, then it has been a different story. I mean, to make a long story short, even the Communist Party, I mean, before the Communist Party was imported into China, the Chinese society never really had formal political party as a human organization. So you wonder why that is the case, right? I don't want to get too much into that, but let me stop here.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to collect 3 questions. So I just saw, and we're going to cut the Gordian knot, but I'm just going to come over.
Oh, here? Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm Satrio Tanujoyo from Tanoto Foundation. Actually, I have one remark and a question, especially to Professor Chen. Well, China is not intimidating, you said, but maybe true. Growing up in Indonesia, also from the Chinese background, and I lived in China for 11 years, what you said, it might be true, but with the move in the South China Sea, with the move of the investment everywhere, the Western world, having lived in the Western world for also 15 years, then I can understand how people can see that China is not intimidating. You see, that's my remark. Actually, my question is about the this. China yesterday was emperorship from emperor dynasty, from the dynasty to dynasty, 70 years to 300 years. But today, some people also explain to me that China has not changed for the last 5,000 years. It is still a dynasty, and it is called the Communist dynasty. And the emperor, the last emperor was Puyi, but the emperor today is Xi Jinping. I want to have your comments on that.
Great. I'm just going to collect the questions. This gentleman here, and your name is Matthew Strauss.
Yeah.
1 minute.
I will do that. More for Anand, just on RCEP and also what you're mentioning about growth falling below 5%. What do you think it does for the Modi government in regards to nationalism and trying to propelate that up in the absence of having policies to turn around the economy quickly? Do you think they would revisit RCEP, or does it make them even more resolved not to join if the economy is slowing down further?
Great, thank you. And then we have Herbert here.
Yeah, Herbert Dieter from AGI. We haven't spoken a lot about Europe and Europe's policies towards the Asia-Pacific. And you may have noticed that last week something rather extraordinary happened. French President Macron was in Beijing, and he was standing there deliberately using a European rather than a French flag. He was trying to represent Europe, and I think it is a rather remarkable development that we witness at the moment in Europe. China seems to be unifying Europe. Chancellor Merkel, Germany will have the presidency of the European Union in the second half of next year. She said, whenever we meet the Chinese government, we will only do that as a group. We will not have kind of one-on-one relations and contacts with China. So belatedly, and this is a question to Kishore, is probably the continuing rise of China fueling a deeper integration of the European Union, tongue-in-cheek. Thank you.
So I'm going to give you guys 2 minutes each, 3 minutes each, just to quickly go respond to any of the questions or say anything you wish to summarize. Yep. Please, Kishore.
Well, my question was very straightforward about Europe. And I would be very happy if Macron and Merkel succeed in unifying Europe and developing Europe as an independent, strong geopolitical player. Because if they were if there are two big elephants in the room today in terms of economic size, there are China and United States. The third big elephant in economic terms is Europe. But as you know, Europe, the paradox about Europe is an economic giant and a geopolitical dwarf. It's a fact. So if Europe can convert its economic strength into becoming a geopolitical giant, it'd be very good for the world. And indeed, Europe has a major strategic opportunity because at the end of the day, if you live in a small, interdependent global village, and that's what we live in today, we need stronger global village councils. We need to strengthen multilateralism. The strongest, the organization with multilateralism deeply buried in its genes is the European Union. European Union should be a leader in terms of defending multilateral institutions. But to give you Exhibit A, World Trade Organization, European Union is incapable of standing up against the United States in defending the World Trade Organization. And if President Macron is genuinely sincere and he wants a stronger European voice, he only has to do one simple step, very easy step. France, as you know, is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. France on its own doesn't deserve to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's no longer a giant. Why doesn't France share its Security Council seat with the rest of the Europe? And when it does it, I'll say, yes, you have changed.
Zhiwu?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for the comment and the wonderful question. I would say, yeah, when people make a statement that the Chinese civilization or the Chinese society has not changed for 5,000 years or longer, my trusted archaeologists will say that there's only a written record to support the claim that the Chinese civilization has lasted about 3,700 years. So prior to this recent period, there's no written record for us to make any claim whether there has been continuation or not. You're right. I actually, from my own research, we have found that at least as of the 17th century, all the way to the 18th and 19th century, for the Chinese society, the homicide rate level at the low for ordinary people was about 1/3 or 1/5 of the homicide rate level for Western European societies during the same period. So what that means is at the bottom of the society, the order and structuring had done probably more efficiently in China than in Western Europe, mainly because the Confucian scholars focused most of their efforts really on structuring the intra-lineage and kinship level ordering and so on. But on the other hand, because they have not spent enough time working out the super infrastructure, it's like how the government power and the power transition from one emperor to another, from one dynasty to another, because of this lack of efforts for several thousand years. For Chinese emperors, their rate of being killed, of dying unnaturally. So in other words, the regicide rate for Chinese emperors of the last 2,500 years was at least 3 to 4 times higher than for European kings and queens, at least over the period from 500 AD to about 1600 AD. So that just shows that Europeans focus more on working things out, the checks and balances on power at the higher level. But the Chinese scholars and philosophers focus more on the bottom structuring. So, and then as a result, then our data just support this sort of hypothesis that I've been trying to push. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, Kato-san and then Anant, please.
I think nobody asked me a question, but Professor Mahbani pointed out, it's a strategic mistake for India, to withdraw from the RCEP. Now, what's happening in Japan? The government and intellectual discussion. India, on the RCEP's negotiation, shouldn't or couldn't be absent. If you withdraw, you are not in part of RCEP. It is not completed. So this is what Japanese government and intellectuals are discussing about. So this is, I think this would be a very, negative, impact in terms of business cycle in regional integration.
Great. And finally,
thank you. Thank you so much for the 12th question on RCEP today. I'm not counting. But I think you asked a deeper question, which a lot of people in India are trying to figure out, which is, what is the relationship between Modi's popularity and economic performance? And it's very puzzling because in 2018, the lead up to the election, the economy wasn't doing well. He'd done this demonetization. I don't know if you're aware of how they'd removed the notes out of circulation, and then there was a GST tax that was poorly implemented. All the surveys said people were downbeat about the economy, that they were not going to do well, and what happened in 2019. So it's a really puzzling thing, and the sense is, for now, he seems pretty much politically untouchable in the sense that however bad the economy is doing, surveys seem to show he's as popular as he was. I don't know how long that will continue, it's anyone's guess, but I think the Indian people have a track record of surprising people who seem invincible. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it hasn't been resolved yet.
So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry we rushed through civilizations in the last time that we had, but I think we managed. So thank you very much, and please give applause to our panel. Thank you.